Welcome to the subject Software Engineering. We are in chapter System Models. Today we shall study Behavioral Model. Behavior models are used to describe the overall behavior of the system. There are two types of behavior models. They are data flow model and state machine model. Students, we have studied earlier the system models, that is the context model we have studied, and now we are studying behavioral model. In this behavioral model, how does the system behave, overall processes are carried out, that is depicted in behavioral model. There are two types of behavioral model, one data flow model, another is state machine model. Point number 3, data flow model. It models the data processing in the system. So students, data flow model, as the name suggests, it depicts how the data processing takes place in the system. Point number 4, state machine model. It models how the system reacts to the events. Students, state machine model, you know, as the system undergoes various state and how the system reacts to the events, that is depicted in the state machine model. Now we shall study in detail types of behavioral models. Point number 1. The main two types of behavioral models, namely data flow model and state machine model, may be used separately or together depending on the type of system that is being developed. Students, we know there are two types of behavioral models. One is data flow model and second is state machine model. Each have got their own identity. So we may use them separately to depict a system, or we may use them together depending upon the type of system that we are developing. Some systems are very simple, some systems are complex in nature. So to explain the system, we may take help of one of the models or both the models. Point number 2. Most business systems are primarily driven by the data. They are controlled by the data inputs to the system with relatively little external events processing. Hence, data flow model is most appropriate for representing business system. Yes, students, you know, in a business system, okay, they are entirely comprising of data. Data is the input, data is processed, and data is given out. So there is no event that causes change in the state. So here for business systems, data flow model is most appropriate. Point number 1. Real-time systems are often event-driven with minimal data processing. Hence, a state machine model is the most suitable to represent their behavior. Students, you know, in real-time systems which immediately react to the given situation, these systems are event-driven and there is very little data processing. Hence, as these systems, that is real-time systems, are event-driven, the state machine model is most suitable to represent their behavior. Point number 2. Other classes of system may be both data and event-driven. In these cases, one may develop both types of models. Students, you know, there are many systems which are complex in nature, so they may be both, that is data driven and event driven. Hence you can take help of both the data flow model and system model. Today we shall study data flow models. Point number 1. Data flow models are an intuitive way of showing how the data is processed by a system. So students, as the name suggests, data flow model is the way of depicting how data is processed in the system. Point number 2. When carrying out analysis, they should be used to model the way in which data is processed in the existing system. So students, when you are developing system, analysis is important phase. In this case, the data flow model should explain how the data is processed in an existing system. So this data flow model helps in analysis of the system. Point number 3. The notations used in data models represent 1. Rounded rectangle represents functional processing. Rectangle represents data store, and labeled arrows represent data movements between the functions. Students, as you know, in the model we use various notations to depict how the system goes on. So here in data flow model we take help of rounded rectangles, simple rectangle and labeled arrows. This rounded rectangle stand for functional processing and rectangle stands for data store or data storage, how the data is stored, and labeled arrows stand for showing the movements of the data between the two functions. Point number 1. Data flow models are used to show how the data flows through the sequence of processing steps. For example, processing step could be to filter duplicate records in the customer database. Students, as we have studied earlier, data flow models represent how the data flows from one processing step to another. If you consider the database, that is the customer database, then one of the processing step could be to filter the duplicate records, or the other steps could be to arrange the records in increasing orders of the names. Point number 2. The data is transformed at each step before moving on to next stage. So students, at every step data is transformed, and because the data is transformed, a new step is created and data is moved to the next stage. We'll be taking one example in the next case. Point number 3. The processing steps or transformation represent software processes or functions. When the data flows diagrams are used to document a software design. So students, when we take help of the data flow diagrams to document a software design, each processing step or transformation represent one of the other software processes or functions. So that is one of the transformation represents a processing step. For example, we'll be considering data flow diagram of the order processing. So this is the diagram of order processing. The model shows how the order for the goods such as computer equipment moves from process to process. It also shows the data stores, for example, order file and budget file that are involved in this process. Let us study what are the advantages of data flow model. First advantage, they are useful to the analyst as it is possible to track and document how the data associated with a particular process moves through the system. So students, the data flow model tracks, okay, how the data moves from one process to another process in a system. So it helps analysts to identify and track the movement of the data. Second advantage, they are simple and intuitive. Okay, so it is very simple to understand and self-learning. Point number 3, it is easy to explain to the potential users. So as these are the diagrams, okay, and the steps are written in it, so it is easy to explain to the user community who may not belong to the technical field. In principle, point number 1, in principle, the development of data flow model should be a top-down process. That is, one must first analyze the process, okay, and then the sub-processes. Students, okay, when you are going in for a data flow model, you should have top-down process. That is, you should first consider, okay, the overall process and then the sub-processes. For example, the overall process can be a procurement process and the sub-process could be ordering of an equipment. Point number 2, data flow models show functional perspective where each transformation represents a single function or process. So students, data flow model stands for functions or process that is being carried out, okay, and each transformation represents one of the functions or processes. Point number 3, they show the entire sequence of actions that take place from an input being processed to the corresponding output, that is the system's response. So students, the entire sequence of the actions in the data flow model represents what is the input, how that data is processed, and what is the output. So students, the data flow diagram or data flow model shows how the data enters into system, what are the various processing steps that it undergoes, and how it is shown in the output. So data flow model are very easy to represent behavioral model for any process. We shall stop here and we'll consider the state machine model in the next class. Thank you.